Welcome back, and thank you for joining me. A little later in the hour, we're going to be looking at same-sex couples and taking your phone calls as well. So keep calling in. This is a subject that I've been thinking about doing for quite a while, so I'm glad we've come to it. Seems to be a number of stories that are cropped up in the press, which are linking sexting, photographs, all of these sorts of things. And the most recent headline is Amir Khan, the boxer. He's confessed to sexting women and says he could seek therapy after being confronted by his wife. This couple always, they play out everything in the press, or a lot of things. Speaking to The Sun, Khan added, "The stupidest thing I did was to comment on this woman's picture saying nice." I think it was a little bit more than that if I remember the whole story, but still, I shouldn't have done it. I have respect for my wife. I do think that these things come out of boredom. And then I thought, are they? Because he then says that he's willing to go to therapy to stop sending sexts or texts to women who aren't my wife. I think that nowadays, I'm sighing here, with mental health issues, any help goes a long way. So he's kind of linking it to mental health. Now, research suggests when you talk about addiction to sex, it's a bit of a taboo subject. It affects up to 6% of adults, and I probably think that's a little bit conservative. One study states that the average male sex addict has had 32 different partners before entering treatment. And how do you know you're addicted to sex? I actually know somebody I know two guys who've admitted that when they gave up alcohol or drugs, then they went on to sexual addiction. Some people go on to gambling, etc. For many more, like there's this famous US basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain, who's thought to have had up to 20,000 sexual partners in his lifetime. I'm just reading this here. Now, Mind Matters, we're speaking to a great forensic psychiatrist, Shoham Das. His work takes him inside prisons and secure hospitals like Broadmoor. What he does is help to rehabilitate sex offenders. Shoham, thank you for joining me. We're not suggesting that Amir Khan is a sex offender, but like with any mental health issue, there's kind of a gauge from being addicted to pornography all the way through. Is there a predisposition as to who, and I'm guessing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it tends to be men. Is there a predisposition for being involved in, I guess, I don't know, is there a link between pornography and the sexting and feeling that you have to have many sexual partners? Is there a connection, or they're entirely separate subjects?
Hi, Trisha. Thank you for having me on your show again. It's always a pleasure. The first point I would make is that not everybody who gets caught doing something that they shouldn't be is a sex addict. It can be quite a convenient excuse, can't it? So if we're talking about celebrities, both men and women who have access to, for want of a better term, groupies or sexual opportunities, let's put it that way, and they decide to divulge in those compared to the average person that doesn't have those many opportunities, then that's not an addiction. That's just people doing something and getting caught for it. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is that an actual addiction, any addiction, whether it's gambling, whether it's drugs, whether it's sex, there are actual psychological processes behind that. So when there are constant impulses that you can't resist, when it affects your functioning, so, literally you can't get through your day without masturbating, without looking at pornography, if you're a celebrity sex addict, without, hooking up with a potential partner, those things would fit in the realm of actual addiction. But I just think it's careful that we don't appropriate that incorrectly for people that are trying to make an excuse.
No, I think it's interesting that I'm picking my words very carefully here. Amir Khan, in this particular case, is linking what he's doing to mental health. It's probably more relationship issues, but mental health is a word that is often trotted out in these instances. But let's talk about from the figures showing that I'm just looking at this. March this year, a survey showed that a fifth of teenagers watch pornography frequently, and some are addicted. So is there a predisposition of what kind of, in this case, teenage boy gets addicted? Are there things that happen in their life, or can it just be any teenage boy who gets sucked down a rabbit hole, so to speak?
I think it's a little bit of both, Trisha. So there's definitely some personality traits that would make the average person more open to any kind of addiction, including pornography. So to be specific, things like being very impulsive, not planning for the future, for people that don't really think about the consequences of their actions, those would all they would all predispose any individual to any addiction. People that suffer from sexual trauma themselves might have issues with understanding boundaries. They might feel quite damaged themselves, and they might try and take it out on potential victims because they feel wronged. So they feel there needs to be this power dynamic, but that usually is in the form of actual sexual violence or sexual offending, as opposed to addiction. But I think what we're talking about is something different. I think that it's because some children are exposed to this level of pornography, and the severity of this pornography is so easily available and can increase, that it's almost like they get desensitized to it, right? So because they watch so much porn, it's almost like a constant feedback loop. They need to top the high, if you will, if you use an analogy for using illicit drugs, and that leads them down a dark path of watching very depraved pornography. I think that's the issue.
How do you break that cycle then? I mean, with anybody who's addicted to, let's talk about pornography in particular, how do you break that cycle? Because again, there are reports of when a parent takes away the phone or restricts, access to it, like anybody who's addicted to anything, take away the thing to which they're addicted, they can react. When I say violently, it might not be with violence, but with anger, with grief, all of those sorts of things. So how do you break the cycle?
Well, I think that you need a two-pronged approach. There has to be an internal change and external factors as well. So the external restrictions would be exactly what you're saying. So you decrease the access to a thing, whether that thing is phones, whether it's the internet, whether it's pornography, whether it's drugs. But that's only one part of it, because if you don't do the inner therapy to look at the actual personality traits, if you don't try and change somebody internally, then as you say, they're just left with this kind of frustration and no outlet for it. So I think you're setting up to fail if you only eliminate the possibility of access to the vice, and if you don't actually work on the personality traits and the internal epiphany.
Does it tend to be mainly males, or have I got that wrong? Is it just that we tend to equate this with males and it's not linked to women because it's not reported or goes unreported?
No, you're right. It's overwhelmingly by far more a male problem than it is a female problem. Men have higher testosterone levels, generally have higher sex drives as well. Another kind of aspect that we've touched on, we haven't really gone into, is this linked? Is hypersexuality linked to mental illness? Yeah. And I think it's a very interesting question. It's quite complicated. I would say that it can be. So when people are depressed, typically they have a low libido, lower sex drive, low appetite, low sleep. But you do get atypical cases where you get the opposite, where you get people who binge eat too much, they oversleep, and they are hypersexualized in their behavior. And that's because they might have a feeling of emptiness or loneliness or worthlessness. So they just use sex to connect to another human being. But I can't stress enough, it is a very small proportion of cases. We're talking probably less than 10% of your average person that suffers with depression.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the way in which it's reported and the way and the language people use, it ends up being, it ends up being linked, and people erroneously think that the two things go together. Another interesting area. I know somebody whose area, I couldn't believe this, is expertise in working with offenders who have sexual attacked older women, and when I say elderly women, and that's an area that is not covered at all. And when it is covered, it's covered in such a lurid way. But what is that about? Again, do you have a specific? I know we're talking about small numbers of the population, I might add, but it is an area that isn't talked about. And when we talk about elder abuse, it covers areas I know from working with social workers. It's something that's not spoken about. It's something that's hidden, and it's something that people do need to be aware of.
Yeah, so I would say that people who have who sexually offend against the elderly would fall broadly into two different categories. There's those that do it simply because of ease of access and they're opportunistic. So they might work, for example, in care homes. It's not too dissimilar, I guess, to people who are attracted to children sexually, pedophiles. There are some that do it simply because it's easier to get away with. And then you have the small but very dangerous proportion of people that have what we psychiatrists would call a paraphilia. So we always like to give things complicated names to sound clever, right? So paraphilia is when you're sexually attracted to something, a situation or a person or a circumstance that the average typical human being wouldn't find sexually attractive. So absolutely, there is a paraphilia towards elderly people. It is very, very rare and it needs very specific kind of therapy. So you need somebody to sit down over a regular period, over many, many sessions to get to the root of exactly what's caused that. So oftentimes there is some kind of sexualized incident that happened to the individual when they were young, and subconsciously or consciously they're drawn to that. And that's what kind of drives their sexual preferences.
Sure, it must be really difficult. I'm just thinking about you when you say, you and I both know that you don't just get over anything that we're talking about. And when we talk about any sexual addiction, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have spent many, many hours sitting opposite the sorts of people who are probably labeled pariahs by society, but they're humans with a story. Would I be right in saying that the general public and the way that the media it's headlines, so it's good, bad, evil, what have you, but it's far more intricate and complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you remember the last time that you had me on your show, we talked about an uncomfortable truth, which was that almost every perpetrator of a physical or sexual offense that I see has been a victim in some way. So they've either had very lax parenting, neglectful parents, have been victims of physical or sexual abuse themselves, or neglect, or poverty, or drug and alcohol use. There's so many factors, and it's very rare for the people that I see to not have had some of that in their life. And it's not a comfortable thing to accept or to talk about, because, as you say, the media especially likes to portray people in black and white, or either good or evil. It reminds me of my kids watching their programs. There's goodies and baddies. There's nothing in between. In reality, everybody's, not everybody. I think there are some people who are extreme ends of evil, is what we talked about when I was last on. Cannot be changed. But they're exceptionally rare. I think most people can be rehabilitated if they have an internal motivation.
One of the reasons, just to finish off, one of the reasons that I've been involved with, and I've talked about it on this show before, Home Start and parenting, early parenting, is because, and I've been trained as an adoptive mother as well. And when you look at the premise that virtually 99.9% of parents love their children, but love of a child and translating that into some of the things you touched upon, eliminating chaos, children who don't know when their next meal or when their next hit is coming, and all of those things, and a fear, and what that does in early childhood. The parent can love them, but if the parent's got an addiction problem, a mental health problem, or is just run ragged, or is poor, or all of those sorts of things, for some children, not all of them, that's where they go off the rails. Would I say, when we talk about preventative mental health across the board, that's where it begins?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some parents have the best intentions for their children, but they don't know how to express love. They don't know how to express emotion, affection. And sometimes that's because of the way that they were brought up. If you're brought up in a household where you're punished very, very harshly for doing even something slightly wrong, then it's quite hard to unlearn those patterns.
Absolutely. And I've got some questions. Are there, what are the stages of sex addiction? I mean, we talked about the origins from, something that, as you said, the vast majority of people that you see have had some sort of sexual abuse themselves. Does it escalate? Are there different stages? And what happens if it's just left? I mean, what's the worst case scenario, I guess I'm asking you?
Sure. So in most people, it does escalate. I would say most people, because it depends on your internal natural personality, how risk averse an individual is, how they balance up that risk reward ratio. So for people that have this lack of fear, then a bit like we were talking about before, they almost need to up their high by getting more sensation, by doing something even more depraved. And that can and does lead to sexual offending. And again, if that goes unchecked, then the veracity and the boldness of that can increase. So you can get very dangerous situations. So 𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐻𝐻 is an example that immediately jumps into my head. He's I'm sure your viewers will know, the policeman who in his past had some very low level over sexualized behavior like flashing, etc., because he was a policeman, wasn't taken seriously, brushed under the carpet by the rest of the police force. And that allowed him to escalate to do the horrible things that he did with Sarah Everett. So that's a perfect example. If you don't nip it in the bud, then it can get out of control. Absolutely.
And what about, I mean, just to end up, that horrific case of that, he worked in a hospital, that chap who violated bodies. I mean, is that an extreme end of sex addiction? It's almost unthinkable. Most of us can't even go there, but most of us have never seen a dead body, let alone be turned on by it, if I can put it that way. I mean, how does that happen, for God's sake?
What's going on?
I mean, how does it happen?
Good question. I think it's not too dissimilar to your previous question about people that have paraphilias about the elderly. I think you can broadly categorize those kind of people into two groups. Those who are just hypersexualized, addicted to any kind of sex, and literally do what they do with dead bodies, necrophilia, because of the ease of access, because they think they're going to get away with it because their victims can't tell on them. And a smaller proportion are actually only sexually turned on by dead bodies. So that is a very specific paraphilia, but it exists, and it's
wow.
It's quite hard,
and the fact that
for us to get our head around.
It is hard for us to get our head round, but thanks to you, we've had a glimpse into, I guess, the very dark areas. Shohan, I love talking to you because it does go beyond headlines and as we said, Star Wars and goodies and baddies. It's humans in all their in the entire range. I love talking to you. Shohan Das, Consultant Forensic Psychiatrist there. Wow. Lots to think about. But coming up next, same-sex parenting, plus your calls on what Italy is doing and how you feel about same-sex parenting. All of that right after this break.